Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me, as always, is Laura.
It is so good to be here on this beautiful Sunday morning, Rick. And I have honestly been waiting all week to dig into today's story because it touches every single person who has ever typed a message into a chatbot.
That is quite the tease, so let's get right into it. This past week, on June 4th of 2026, OpenAI began rolling out something it calls Dreaming v3, and I think it might be the most consequential change to ChatGPT in years.
I completely agree, and here is the headline in plain language. Dreaming v3 is a brand new memory architecture for ChatGPT, and it fundamentally changes how the system remembers you because instead of a manually curated list of saved memories, it now synthesizes what it knows about you in the background automatically without you ever asking it to.
So let's unpack that for listeners who maybe haven't followed the evolution of ChatGPT memory closely. Walk us through what memory looked like before this update, because I think the contrast is really what makes this story land.
Absolutely. So up until now, ChatGPT memory was essentially a notebook with sticky notes in it. When you told the model something important, like your job title or your dietary preferences, it would jot down a discrete saved memory, and you could open the settings page and see that literal list of facts it had written down about you.
Right. And the key thing about that old system was that it was fundamentally static. The model wrote a note, and that note just sat there unchanged until you manually deleted it, or the model happened to overwrite it, which honestly led to some pretty stale and sometimes contradictory profiles over time.
Exactly. And that staleness is precisely the problem Dreaming v3 was built to solve. The new architecture runs a background synthesis process between your sessions, reading across years of past conversations, and it updates, merges, and revises what it remembers about you without any prompting whatsoever. OpenAI says it focuses on 3 dimensions, which are freshness, continuity, and relevance.
And the name itself is fascinating to me because OpenAI is explicitly drawing an analogy to human sleep. The idea is that this synthesis happens offline between conversations, the way our brains consolidate memories overnight, which is why they landed on the word dreaming rather than something dry like background indexing.
It is a genuinely evocative name, and the canonical example OpenAI gives is wonderful. Suppose you told ChatGPT months ago that you are going to Singapore in July. Under the old system, that note would sit there forever in the present tense. Under Dreaming, once the trip has passed, the memory silently revises itself to say you went to Singapore in July of 2026.
That tense change sounds tiny, but it is actually profound because it means the system now has a working model of time. It understands that facts about you have expiration dates, that plans become history, and that a good assistant should never ask you about a trip you took 8 months ago as if it were still upcoming.
And the benchmark numbers OpenAI published alongside the launch really do back up the ambition here. On their own internal memory evaluation, factual recall rose from about 41.5% back in 2024 to 82.8% today, which is essentially a doubling of the system's ability to correctly remember things about you.
Now, I want to flag for our listeners that those are OpenAI's own internal numbers. So we should hold them loosely until independent researchers can replicate them. But even directionally, going from roughly 2 in 5 facts recalled to more than 4 in 5 is a very meaningful jump in user experience.
That is a fair caveat, and the same internal report card shows the harder categories still lagging, with preference recall and time-sensitive recall both landing in the low to mid-70s. So the system is dramatically better, but it is not perfect, and OpenAI themselves acknowledge that revising memories correctly over time remains an open research problem.
Let's talk about the rollout mechanics for a moment, because there is a detail in here that I think reveals a lot about where OpenAI's priorities are. This did not launch to everyone at once, did it?
No, it launched on June 4th to ChatGPT Plus and Pro subscribers in the United States first, with other tiers and international markets promised in the coming weeks. But here's the detail that jumped out at me, Rick. OpenAI says it achieved roughly a 5 times reduction in the compute needed to serve this streaming process. And that efficiency gain is what makes a free tier rollout economically practical for the first time.
That compute number is the part of this story I find most strategically interesting because memory was historically a premium feature precisely because it was expensive to run. If you can cut the serving cost by a factor of 5, suddenly you can afford to give a persistent, personalized assistant to every free user on the planet.
And the scale of that statement is staggering when you remember the other milestone that crossed the wires this very week, which is that ChatGPT has reportedly surpassed 1 billion monthly active users. So we are talking about potentially giving a self-updating, autobiographical memory of every conversation to a user base the size of a continent.
1 billion monthly users with persistent memory is genuinely a different product category than a chatbot. At that point, you are describing something closer to a lifelong digital companion that accumulates context about your career, your family, your health questions, and your finances year after year after year.
Which brings us inevitably to the other side of this story because not everyone is celebrating, and I think the critics have raised some points this week that deserve to be taken very seriously rather than dismissed as reflexive privacy hand-wringing.
This is exactly where I wanted to go next because the thing that caught my eye in the coverage was this phrase that kept appearing, which is the idea that the failure mode of memory has moved from neglect to silent revision. Can you explain what the critics mean by that?
Gladly, because it is a subtle but crucial point. Under the old system, the worst case was that ChatGPT forgot something or kept a stale note, which is annoying but visible. Under dreaming, the system autonomously rewrites what it believes about you. So a memory that was accurate 3 months ago may have been silently corrected in a way you never explicitly saw or approved.
And the practical consequence of that is an auditability problem, right? If the assistant behaves differently in your 500th session than it did in your 5th session, reconstructing exactly why, which memory changed, when it changed, and what conversation triggered the change becomes genuinely difficult for an ordinary user.
Precisely. And there was a study published this year that gave this dynamic a memorable name, the personalization convenience paradox. The researchers found that persistent synthesis of user profiles creates a situation where the feature users value most, which is effortless personalization, is also the feature they are least able to fully audit or constrain.
That paradox feels like it applies to so much of modern technology, honestly. The magic and the opacity are the same mechanism. The whole point of dreaming is that you do not have to manage your own memory list anymore, but the moment you stop managing it, you also stop seeing it.
And there is a regulatory clock ticking on all of this, which adds real stakes beyond the philosophical debate. The European Union's AI Act includes transparency obligations for chatbot systems that are scheduled to take effect on August 2nd of 2026, which is less than 2 months after this rollout began.
So OpenAI is shipping a system that autonomously revises user profiles right before a major jurisdiction starts enforcing new disclosure and data governance standards on exactly that kind of behavior. That is either very confident timing or very risky timing, depending on how charitable you want to be.
My read is that they knew the deadline was coming and built for it because the transparency tooling they shipped alongside Dreaming is actually fairly extensive. Users can still view, edit, or delete any individual memory the system has stored, and temporary chats remain a complete opt-out where nothing gets stored or referenced later.
And for the enterprise and security-minded folks in our audience, I understand there is an audit logging capability as well, which seems aimed directly at the compliance departments that would otherwise veto this feature inside large organizations.
That is right. Security teams can review a chronological feed of every memory creation, edit, and deletion, with context about which specific conversation triggered each action. And in a move I genuinely did not expect, OpenAI published its memory API and invited outside researchers from the Berkman Klein Center and the Electronic Frontier Foundation to review the system's privacy guarantees.
Inviting the EFF to kick the tires is a notable gesture because that is an organization with a long track record of not pulling punches when it finds problems. Do we know yet whether those external reviews have produced any findings, or is it too early?
It is too early. The invitation only went out alongside the launch. So the reviews are presumably just getting underway, and I think their eventual findings will be a story we revisit on this show. What we can say today is that opening the protocols to adversarial outside review is a stronger commitment than the usual trust us framing we see from big labs.
Let's zoom out to the competitive landscape for a minute, because OpenAI is obviously not the only company that understands memory is the next battlefield. How does this move reposition them against the other frontier labs?
It is a clear escalation because memory is arguably the stickiest feature in all of consumer AI. Every rival assistant has some form of persistent context now, but dreaming raises the bar from remembering what you said to maintaining a living, self-correcting model of who you are. And that depth of personalization creates switching costs that are very hard for a competitor to overcome.
That switching cost point is worth dwelling on, because if your assistant has 3 years of accumulated synthesized context about your life, moving to a rival product means starting over as a stranger. It is the same lock and dynamic we saw with photo libraries and music playlists, except this time the asset is a model of your entire working memory.
And unlike playlists, this asset is largely invisible to you, which compounds the lock-in. You cannot easily export the synthesized understanding the model has built. You can only export the raw conversations, and the synthesis itself, the actual dreaming output, is the proprietary part that lives inside OpenAI's infrastructure.
That raises a question I suspect regulators will eventually ask, which is whether users should have a right to portability for these synthesized profiles, the same way data protection law gave people the right to download their raw data from social platforms a decade ago.
I think that is exactly where this goes, and the August deadline in Europe may be the first forcing function. If transparency obligations require systems to disclose how they build and revise user profiles, then portability and contestability feel like the natural next demands. And honestly, memory portability could become a genuine policy battleground over the next year.
All right, let's bring this down to street level for our listeners, because most people hearing this are not regulators or researchers. They are everyday users wondering what changes for them on Monday morning. What does this actually mean in practice for someone who uses ChatGPT regularly?
The practical experience is that the assistant will simply feel sharper and less forgetful. It will stop asking you to re-explain your job, it will remember that your daughter's recital already happened, and it will tailor answers to preferences you expressed months ago. For most people, most of the time, that is a pure quality of life improvement with no action required.
But given everything we just discussed about silent revision, I assume you have some hygiene recommendations for the more privacy-conscious listeners, the people who want the benefits without handing over an unexamined autobiography to a frontier lab.
I have 3, and they are all easy. First, actually open the memory settings page once a month and skim what the system believes about you, because you can edit or delete anything that feels wrong or too sensitive. Second, use temporary chats for anything involving health, finances, or other people's private information. And third, remember that deleting a conversation does not necessarily unwind what was already synthesized from it, so be thoughtful upstream.
Let me play devil's advocate on the critics for a moment, though, because there is an argument that we are holding AI memory to a standard we never applied to human assistants. A great executive assistant also silently updates their understanding of you, and nobody demands an audit trail of their impressions.
That is a fun framing, but I would push back on 2 grounds. First, a human assistant's memory does not scale to 1 billion people simultaneously. And second, a human cannot be subpoenaed, breached, or acquired by another company along with their complete mental model of you. The scale and the persistence change the ethics, not just the engineering.
That is a fair rebuttal, and the breach scenario is the one that genuinely keeps me up at night. A database of synthesized psychological and biographical profiles of 1 billion people is arguably the most valuable social engineering asset ever assembled, and its security posture matters more than almost any other system on the internet.
Which is precisely why the external audits matter so much, and why I want to see the Berkman Klein and EFF findings before I fully celebrate this launch. The architecture is impressive, the user experience gains are real, but the bar for stewardship here is extraordinarily high, and the proof will be in the governance, not the press release.
So let's do our crystal ball segment before we wrap. A year from now, when we look back at the launch of Dreaming V3, what do you think we will say it actually changed about the AI landscape?
I think we will say it was the moment personalization became the primary axis of competition in consumer AI, displacing raw model intelligence. Once every frontier model is brilliant, the assistant that wins is the one that knows you best. And Dreaming was OpenAI planting its flag on exactly that hill, with 1 billion users already standing on it.
My prediction is slightly different because I think the lasting legacy will be regulatory. I suspect Dreaming becomes the test case that defines how synthesized user profiles get governed worldwide. And the precedent set between now and that August deadline in Europe will shape every memory system that comes after it.
I would genuinely love for both of us to be right, because that combination, fierce competition on personalization plus real governance guardrails, is honestly the best version of this future. And either way, Rick, the era of the goldfish chatbot that forgets you between sessions is now officially permanently over.
Beautifully put as always, Laura, and a perfect note to end on. To our listeners, check your memory settings this week. Stay curious about what your tools remember about you, and join us again next Sunday for another deep dive. That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.